In this video, we are going to learn how to do the blanket stitch, which is a decorative stitch. It is based off of an embroidery stitch. We see it a lot of times on the outer edges of fleece or wool blankets, hence the name. But it is also very similar to a stitch that we use when we are doing millinery and attaching wire to the outer brim. So this is one of the reasons why I think it's important to understand how this stitch works if you're going to be in costume. So when you look at this stitch, you can see it makes these vertical lines that are going straight up and down. And then you have a horizontal line that rests on the very edge of the fold of the fabric. And so it looks the same on both the front and the back. So we are going to do this sample through a double layer of muslin, just so we have a little bit more thickness here to stitch through. I think one layer of cotton is a little weak, so 2 layers is great. I've also drawn a line for a guide for myself. This is a friction marker, so it'll disappear when I press on it. And I've also went ahead and marked my intervals of where I want the stitch, just so I can be very consistent. Normally I'm using a 10mm needle, but I have decided for this sample to use a slightly heavier thread. This is a Mara 30 buttonhole thread from Gutermann. And so as a result, it would be really difficult to get through a very tiny milliner eye. So instead I'm using a 9 sharp, which was much easier to thread. And then I went ahead and conditioned it with some Thread Heaven to try to keep it from knotting on me as I'm going. So then the first thing we need to do is we need to put a knot in our thread. So I'm going to wrap this around my finger and roll that off. And then we are going to go ahead and trim close to the knot, but not right at the knot because we don't want it to slip off. So now I'm doing 2 layers, so we could do a couple of different things. Usually what I would say is you could start here and put your knot through there and come all the way up to the top. Or if you wanted to, you could also just pull your 2 layers apart and start your knot right at the top. But we're going to do the method that you see here on the sample, the first sample, which is that I have a knot here, and then I'm going to come straight up into there. So when I'm doing this, it's a little strange because when we come up, we're going to go straight through that fabric. My knot is right there. Now, if I really wanted to hide this knot, then I would go ahead and hide it between the 2 layers. And then only this time, I'm actually going to just take a very tiny stitch at the very top of this so that I can anchor it. And this is only necessary for the first stitch. So then my second stitch, I'm going to pull my thread over across the top like this. And then I'm going to stay very, going straight up and down. And I'm going to pull my needle through the 2 layers of fabric. And then I have this loop that's formed up here. So you can see I have a big loop here. And I'm pulling my needle through that loop. And that is what's going to help create the line that goes straight across the top. Now, notice how if I pull this too tight, it starts to pull my fabric. So you have to really regulate how much you tighten that so that it doesn't do that. So we're going to just come, and we want to make sure that that's staying straight up and down. Now, because of the way that we did this stitch, you'll notice that we have a line on this side and a line on this side. And that's ultimately what we're going for. I still pull that a little tight. Okay, there we go. So then I'm going to do the same thing over here. I have my thread. I loop it across the top. I'm going to go straight down. And then I'm going to pull this up. And it's basically going over this loop that I created at the top. And then I'm going to pull this straight up so that I'm not pulling it too tight and I'm allowing that to sit. Again, I'm folding that over. Coming straight down through the fabric. The thing that's so interesting about this stitch is it feels like you're doing more stitching through the fabric, but the fabric actually, you're only anchoring it to the fabric at the bottom of each of these vertical lines. It's not anchored at the top at all. It's only anchored at the base. So this is a fun stitch. It is an embroidery style stitch, so you'll find it in embroidery books and used as a common embroidery technique. It's fun to do flowers with this, going around the outer edges of a circle, create sort of a wagon wheel. It can look like a wagon wheel embroidery stitch when you do that. It also is very similar to what we also call a buttonhole stitch. The difference is with the buttonhole stitch, you're doing the same technique, but at a much smaller scale, and the stitches are closer together, but it is exactly the same technique when you do a hand buttonhole. And we're just going to continue. Again, you'll notice I always lay my thread very purposely when I'm done pulling it tight. I lay it over so that then when I'm coming up through here, and I am doing this upside down. I normally would not do this, but for the camera, I would usually hold this the other direction. But I do like to keep it flat on the table so that I can try to make sure I'm not pulling it too tight, causing any puckers. It just helps make the whole thing lay much nicer. Okay. Now this is my last stitch. So this one is a little different. We are going to do the same thing as before. We're going to make our loop. I'm going to come straight down. I'm going to pull it up and I'm going to pull this tight. Now, because this is my last stitch, if I were just to knot it, then it wouldn't actually hold anything. It would all come undone. And so what I have to do is, you can see my thread is here. I need to basically anchor that. So at the very top here, I'm just going to take one small stitch through the fold of the fabric, and that will anchor all of this in place, keeping it from moving anywhere. And then I'm going to put my knot right there. And then I will hide my tail. Of course, my needle came undone. So this is a challenge to try to get my needle rethreaded. And then I'm going to take one last stitch next to there, going between the layers. So you'll see it's going between the layers. And I pull that tight. I trim that close. That pulls my knot nice and tight down below, plus then it's protecting my tail. And you can see here that now that I've done that, I can come over this with my hot iron. My marks have gone away, and I have a beautiful blanket stitch. It looks the same on this side as it does this side. So it's a fun stitch to know, and it can go to a lot of other techniques, from the buttonhole stitch to the millinery wire stitch. So enjoy.